Hey everybody, today we're going to be talking about World War One, and the focusing topics that we're going to be reviewing in this short lecture is causes, mobilization, preventing dissent, U.S. limits, and fears and failures in the war. So let's get started. We got a lot to cover. So World War One at the time was called the War to End All Wars, and this war was called that because it was a major world war that involved nations from all over the world, and it also resulted in lots of widespread death and destruction. And it was a different type of war by the fact that it was fought mainly in the trenches along the western front of France. So it was a war that really changed things. It really changed our history and our path. And so let's talk about how it all got started. So the causes of the war. We refer to an acronym to help students remember the four main causes of the war: militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. So let's review those quickly. So militarism stands for the fact that many nations had been building up their military, getting ready for any type of conflict. So when all they needed was a reason to go to war. Alliances. Many nations had allied together, and they had promises that if they were attacked, that the other nation would come in and help. Britain was allied with France. Russia would always also come into this alliance, and the United States later on. And Germany was allied with Austria. The third letter is I for imperialism. During this period of history, we've already studied how imperialism, the basic definition is stronger nations go and take over weaker nations, and they do so in order to get natural resources and labor sources. And these nations usually don't really appreciate this very much, and some of them develop a little bit of resentment toward these stronger nations, and they desire to get their independence. That leads us to the last letter N, which stands for nationalism. During this period of time, there was a lot of patriotism and nationalism going on among nations. This nationalism or love of country would affect these independence movements that were coming out of imperialism, and would result in the actual spark that set off the war, and that was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He is the next heir to the throne of Austria. There was a group of people who wanted to get their independence from Austria, and this nation named Serbia wanted to gain its freedom from Austria, form its own nation. There was a group of people in an organization called the Black Hand, and there were several assassins who got a plan together to go and make a statement to the Austrian king and say, look, we want our independence. And they went out and they shot and killed not only Franz Ferdinand, the son of the Austrian king, but also his wife, who was actually pregnant at the time. And this was a terrible event. It shocked the world that this could happen, and this caused Austria to get very angry at the small nation of or it wasn't even a nation, small group of Serbians, and to basically lash out at them. And Germany came to the side of Austria with this alliance plan kicking in. Russia came to the defense of the Serbians, and it just cascaded into Russia, and then Britain, and then France joining up, and then all of a sudden we've got a world war, which I said again was fought mostly along the western front in France. It was a long war from 1914 to 1918, mostly trench warfare, where literally there would be battles where sides would only gain, even a few feet of land, and widespread death and lots of suffering, lots of disease. Germany had begun to develop submarines and use those submarines at this time for war purposes. They were using what was known as unrestricted submarine warfare, where they would attack ships in the Atlantic Ocean who were thought to be supplying the allies of Britain and France and Russia. And so Germany was sinking a lot of ships, and some of those ships had Americans on them. And finally, Germany was approached about this and the fact that this was not considered to be a fair way to fight war. And so they made a pledge. They made the Sussex pledge where they agreed, okay, we're not going to shoot or fire upon any ships that we think are not a threat or not at war. And so they basically made the pledge, and then they began to continue to fire upon ships shortly thereafter. In fact, they just didn't keep their promise. And so they went going forward. How did we get involved in the war? Well, you've heard me talk about the other nations already at war. We didn't get involved in the war until one of these ships called the Lusitania was sunk. And this is an article about that. And it was sunk by a German submarine and resulted in the deaths of many, many Americans. And then finally, another event that occurred was that Germany was trying to get the United States provoked into war. And the ambassador to Germany wrote a note to the ambassador of Mexico asking that nation to attack the United States, and if the war was won, that Germany would reward Mexico the land that it had lost in the Mexican-American War. In fact, the British intercepted this note because it came Western Union through the London office, and London actually held on to this note to give it to the United States at the right time, or we would be angry enough to join the war. So after the Lusitania being sunk, and I think it was 128 Americans died, and then the Zimmerman note, the United States says enough is enough, we're going to get in on the war. President Wilson will quickly begin to mobilize the United States towards war, and that means winning the hearts and minds to war and getting the resources together to help win the war. And so he makes this speech, Making the World Safe for Democracy speech. He tells America, look, we're not going to war basically to fight and be an aggressor. We're going to war so that every nation will have the opportunity to decide what kind of government they want, and the world will be better for it. So he quickly gets Congress's approval. Then the 14 points are written by him, and these are the 14 points for peace, and these points are intended to create this better world, safe for democracy after the war, and to get all the nations of the world to agree to these 14 points, and 5 of them are really more important than the other 14. Freedom of the seas was one of them. Free trade, letting countries determine their own governments, those types of things. And we'll talk more about these later. Then the United States will begin to mobilize or get resources together to fight the war. We're going to have to control the information. We're going to go on a propaganda campaign, and this is a very good example over here of the propaganda campaign, to get people to enlist in the U.S. Army, showing a German soldier in the form of a beast who's grabbing up people and beating people up and carrying them off and destroying our culture. And so we're going to control information about the war and motivate people to get involved. The War Industries Board will take over factories. It will control strikes, and it will make sure that factories are producing the items that are necessary to win the war. The National War Labor Board will deal directly with the labor issues of striking and wages. And one of the things that the War Labor Board will do will, control wages and control strikes. And then finally, the Food Administration will basically control food production. It will encourage people to grow their own gardens so that the food, other foodstuffs that are produced for market can be shipped over to our boys in the war. All right, so you can only imagine that all of those controls might have made a few people a little bit upset. And so we had some people who really didn't agree with the controls that were being in place. And in fact, the U.S. government passed a law called the Espionage Act, which said that any person who spoke out against the war effort or against the government during a time of war could be charged under the Espionage Act and potentially executed. Eugene V. Debs, who was a labor union leader who made a speech against the war, and he was actually arrested, prosecuted under the Espionage Act, and sent to prison for 10 years for making a speech against World War I. And basically what he said in this speech was that he felt like that this war would make a lot of money for some people, and it would result in the deaths of many other people who were not wealthy. The young men who would sign up to go fight this war would only be giving their lives, whereas the older, moneyed class would make money from this war. And he was arrested for that. We'll talk a little bit more about Eugene Debs later. Then the Supreme Court actually heard a case against the Espionage Act to find out if this was a violation of free speech, to say that people couldn't speak out against the war, and the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the Espionage Act in 1919. And guys, we still live under this Espionage Act today. U.S. limits. So the U.S. didn't have a very large role in this war. If you go all the way back up here to the very beginning, we know that this war went from 1914 to 1918. We were only involved from 1917 forward. We sent a group of soldiers under the direction of John J. Pershing. It was called the American Expeditionary Force. The U.S. soldiers were known as doughboys. Some people really don't know why we called them doughboys. There are all kinds of theories about why we did, and we'll look at that a little bit later. And then one of the major offensives that we participated in was in the Moose Argonne Forest. Basically, U.S. soldiers were used to protect rail lines for supplies and to protect guns, bullets, those types of things. Moving on, once we win the war in 1918, the Allies win the war, with Germany and Austria losing. We will have some failures that will result from this war that will greatly impact our future as well, and the ability to hold a lasting peace. So during the war, the Russians suffered a major revolution in 1917. And there were many reasons for this. One of the reasons was the land policy in Russia, in which some people were still living in conditions of serfdom, much like the Middle Ages. They didn't own any land. They could only work someone else's land. They didn't get a large portion of the crop. They could barely feed their families. They were very poor, and there was a lot of suffering going on. And Russia had just basically not modernized by letting go of those old land policies. And so a major revolution occurs in which this gentleman, Vladimir Lenin, leads a movement in which he calls for modernization and for the removal of private property and the sharing of resources, government control of the economy, government control of businesses, and a more shared wealth lifestyle. So there is a civil war that occurs briefly between the Reds, communists, and the Whites, and the Reds will win, and Russia will become a communist nation. We will be very, very alarmed by this very quick and shocking turn of events during this war. Russia will leave the war early. The United States will come in later in 1918, and we will have in the United States a big, big fear that this same thing could happen to our nation, that there would be a movement that would result in people clamoring for a better property wealth arrangement that is more equal. A group of senators were very upset about some of the ideas in the peace treaty, and led by a senator named Henry Cabot Lodge, a group of Republicans called the Irreconcilables refused to have the United States join the League of Nations for fear of getting involved in another war, and they never approved the Versailles Treaty that ended World War I. And so basically, we just kind of get out of the war, and we don't have a very good resolution. So these are the major topics and learning objectives for World War I. And our next lesson, we will move forward where the United States will attempt to basically just forget about World War I and return to life as they know it. So I will see you guys again in the Roaring 20s.